Hey guys, Josh here to let you know that InterBrews now has a Patreon page. That's right, you can lend your support to the podcast that's been going 7 years strong, bringing you the best and brightest of the craft beer scene here in Houston and beyond. And as a bonus, as a Patreon subscriber, you can get exclusive episodes of the show. That's right, we'll be doing some special interviews and episodes just for you, our supporters. So thank you so much. If you've loved the show, which I hope that is you if you're listening, then head on over to patreon.com/interbrews or interbrews.com/Patreon or anywhere you see the link. Head on over and lend us your support so that we can keep bringing you the show and make it bigger and better than ever. We appreciate it. Now, on to the show.
The following is a presentation of Stewed Productions.
This is InterBrews.
Hey everybody, welcome to InterBrews, and I'm excited to welcome in Fal Allen, Brewmaster at Anderson Valley Brewing, and the author of a riveting book on one of my favorite styles, Gose, brewing a classic German beer for the modern era. Fal, how you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good, Josh. Thanks for having me on.
Yes. One, I must say, doing my, in air quotes, research for our interview today, our local grocery store actually has a few of your Goses here. We're out in Houston, Texas area, so I'm glad you guys distribute out to this area. But it's the how do you pronounce it? Because this is in the so you're in Anderson Valley there in California. What is the language that you guys have out there?
Well, Anderson Valley is pretty remote. And we have, over the years, developed our own language called Buntling. And Buntling started being developed in the 1880s and was actually even taught in the schools at the early part of last century. And it is, one of three American lingos, Hawaiian Pidgin English, Cajun, and Buntling are the three recognized American lingos. And it was so unique that they used it as a code language during World War I, just like they used Navajo during World War II.
Oh, that's fascinating. I didn't know that. You have on y'all's YouTube channel, you have a couple of videos where obviously some of your beers, or a lot of your beers, reference the lingo, but you have kind of an in-depth, example of using it, and you kind of pick up on a few things from an outsider perspective. Okay, I think I know what beer is. I think I know what guys and girls are, or whatever. But man, completely different language altogether. Do you speak it fluently?
Yeah, by Harpawisli.
Okay.
Which means, yes, I speak a little bit of Buntling.
Okay, very cool. Well, okay, so first of all, let's talk about Anderson Valley Brewing and how you got there and how all this came about, kind of your backstory. So, Fal, what got you into brewing in the first place?
Well, I started home brewing back in the mid-'80s, and, I'd always been kind of fascinated with beer and the idea of fermentation and, who doesn't want to make their own drugs? So I started home brewing, and I was working at a bar in Seattle called Ray's Boathouse, and these guys used to come in and try and sell their beer to us, these craft brewers. Mm-hmm. And one day it kind of dawned on me, hey, wait a minute, somebody's getting paid to make this craft beer. I wonder if I could get paid to make craft beer. And so I started going to the closest brewery, which was Red Hook Brewery, and I started taking my home brew in and forcing the brewer there to drink it. And one day he said, fine, kid, listen, you can have a job, but quit bringing me your home brew. So that was, I think that was 1988 or 87.
Okay. What were some of those, what were some of those first styles that you brewed and you were bringing in?
Well, the very first thing I brewed was a stout. And I figured, start with something dark that can cover up a lot of my faults. Uh-huh. And that first beer I made was, fairly delicious, and that's a good thing because if it had been, really horrible, I might have been discouraged. But it was pretty good. The next 4 or 5 weren't as good as I kind of branched out and tried different styles that were a little more difficult. But eventually, I kind of got a handle on it. So by the time I was bringing him some of my homebrew, I was making, basically British ales, and there were a couple lagers, but, the styles that were out there, I mean, if you went to a brew pub back then, they usually had something light, something dark, and maybe something wheat. And so, the light was usually a pale ale, and the dark was usually a porter or a stout. And then, you had a wheat beer, and maybe it was German or maybe it wasn't. More likely it wasn't.
Yeah.
You got to remember that 30 years ago, we didn't have very many homebrew shops. There was almost no literature in America on homebrewing because it had been illegal for such a long time.
Yeah, I was going to ask where you got your information.
Well, David Lyne's big book on beer was good. And soon after that, I discovered Greg Noonan's Brewing Lager Beer. That was kind of a seminal book for me. That was the first real scientific approach to things that I'd seen. Charlie Papazian's book, The Joy of Home Brewing, of course, was my Bible for many, many, many years.
Yeah.
I carried it around with it, and my college friends who saw it said, "Dude, it's the only book you've ever, used a yellow liner on." So, I spent a lot of time, thumbing through it, and all those books were very helpful, and most of them were out in the mid-'80s. And then slowly, we found other books. There was something called The Practical Brewer, which is still around. It's put out by the Master Brewers Association. I used to call it The Impractical Brewer because the ones that were available back then, easily available anyway, were made for very, very large breweries. Back in the late 70s and early 80s, there were no craft breweries, and to speak of, and then, of course, the books that were written for brewers back then were for these mega breweries, Bud Miller, Coors, and some of the regionals, Henry Weinhardt's, or Blitz, as it was called. So there wasn't a lot of good information. You really kind of had to scrounge and get things from England, where home brewing was still a thing. Germany didn't have a whole lot of home brewers. And so subsequently, I think most small brewers, when they started, made English-style beers because they were ales. They took only 2 weeks as opposed to lagers, which take longer. And that's the information that was available to us.
Yeah, it's a world of difference. We'll get into your specific book, which is actually your second published book for Brewers publication here in just a little bit. But it's a world apart from where we are today. We're so fortunate. Thanksgiving coming up. I'm so thankful that we have all this information here at our fingertips to just to learn about beers, and if you're brewing beers, to brew really, really excellent beers. But it was all of that what you were doing, and that really paved the way for us as home brewers today, and even professional brewers. So it's, I don't know, when you look back on that, do you think, do you ever think of kind of that, the bigger picture, like the impact that you've had personally, and just kind of that your generation of brewers have had on this industry and this American craft brewing scene?
Yeah, it's been a long, strange trip, like they say. And, it's funny, I've been brewing and I'm part of the original generation. The original guys were, Ken Grossman and Mike Hale. Guys who were really early on. And I'm part of that, younger than those guys, but by a few years. And by the time that, I started brewing, there was a Red Hook brewery, Hale's Ales existed up in Seattle, and Ken Grossman was making beer at Sierra Nevada, and I think Bill Owens was starting Buffalo Bills. So there were a few examples. It didn't seem as crazy as it did for those really the first guys. For them, there was just no example for them to follow. There was just, there was England is the only place that were really, England and Germany had small breweries and some in Belgium, but it was just such an outlandish thought for them to, open a brewery. Even when I started brewing, we used to go to parties up in Seattle, and my girlfriend, and I would go, and they'd be introduced, and they'd say, "Oh, and Fal's a brewer," and people were like, "Oh my God, you're a brewer," and they'd want to talk to me, and my girlfriend would stand there thinking, "Wonder what I could say that would make them do that." And so she started out, trying different things out. And one day she's like, "I'm a stripper," and it still didn't get the excitement that I'm a brewer did.
Maybe they knew she didn't have rhythm or something. I don't know. They were like, eh. I don't know. Well, take me through the journey. Take me through the journey from Red Hook from the start to Anderson Valley. What was the journey there?
Well, I was very lucky at Red Hook. When the brewer hired me on, he knew that I really wanted to learn. So he started me at the very bottom. My very first job was actually pulling bungs from old Golden Gate kegs, and then they graduated to Hoff Stevens kegs later. But kegs today don't even have bungs. So I'd spend 7-8 hours a day pulling bungs out of kegs, and you can only do that for so long before your elbows start to give out. And so eventually they hired another guy, and they transferred me up to washing kegs, which was a major improvement. And then I went on to filling kegs and running the filter and doing cellar work, and that was a really good experience for me. I really appreciate the guy Rick Buchanan who did hire me. It was great to work for him, and he was a really nice guy and very helpful in my career to get me motivated starting. But it was a tough job. It didn't pay enough for me to quit my night job, so I was tending bar at night and working in the brewery during the day. And that's only for the young that can do that.
Yeah.
So after about a year, I quit, and I found a full-time job at Pike Brewing, and I stayed with them for 9 years, and that was an even luckier happenstance. I started working for them when Charles and Roseanne Finkel owned the brewery, and they also owned a company named Merchant Devin, which was an importer. And so I was introduced to these world-class craft beers from Europe, and occasionally they'd go on a European trip and they'd take me with them, and some of the other salespeople. And so I got to meet world-class brewers making these beers, back in the early 90s when I think a lot of people they didn't get that kind of opportunity. So I was very lucky to have worked for Pike Place for about 9 years. And then they had some ownership change, and I left there and tried to open my own place down in Georgetown at a place. I was trying to buy a bar and put a brewery in, and I was there for about a year working on that project. And one of my partners was John Hinkenlooper, who I hope that he actually does run for president. That would be fun.
Yeah.
And that didn't work out, and after that kind of fell apart, I thought, well, fine, I'm going south. So I just went south and interviewed at every brewery I came along, and finally settled at Anderson Valley Brewing Company in 2000, and I was hired there as the general manager I worked there from 2000 to 2005 before leaving and going to Asia to open a brewery there. And after 5 years in Singapore, working in Southeast Asia for Asia Pacific Brewing, they own about, I think, 40 or 50 breweries around Asia, mostly big breweries. And I was their first foray into craft brewing. And after being there about 5 years, I decided that I think, every expat comes to this kind of decision, whether you're going to live the rest of your life as an expat or if you're going to go home to your family and friends. And I chose to come home, and kind of serendipitously, Trey White, the guy who now owns Anderson Valley, called me up and he said, "Hey, I think I'm going to end up with Anderson Valley Brewing. What do you think about coming back?" And so, in 2010, I came back to work here, and I've been here since then.
Oh, that's. Tell me more about your time over in Asia. How was the brew scene over there? How was the craft beer accepted? Was it? I don't know. That seems like even now, especially from way over here in Texas, it seems like such a far away world. I would love to just know more about what how the people accepted it and what the reactions were.
Well, again, I've been very lucky, and this was another very lucky piece. I got this job that turns out it was a fabulous job. It was working for this big company, Asia Pacific Brewing. They're half owned by Heineken at the time, and I think they're all owned by Heineken now. Okay. And they wanted to get into craft brewing, and there were a couple craft brewers going, in Singapore in particular, where I was based. But around the region there were a few, but not many. their Brewworks was the notable big brewery that had opened a few years before me showing up, and they had a really good location and they made good beers, and so they were doing pretty well, but they weren't having much luck, outside of their limited clientele. Mm-hmm. They weren't, expanding the market. Polliner had a pub there, and they had for quite some time, but, a Polliner pub mainly catered to the expats, and so they weren't really kind of expanding the market. And when I came on board, the person who was running it, she wanted to really expand the craft beer market and kind of, create a craft beer market. And her concept was to fuse European brewing tradition with Asian cooking tradition. And so the beers we made were really a stretch for a lot of people, probably too much of a stretch. Mm-hmm. But they would be very at home in today's, craft beer market in America. Mm-hmm. And I think they'd be fairly at home in Asian market today. But that was, I was almost 10 years ago, actually more than 10 years ago. And so it was a little bit before its time. But I went to a lot of the Singaporean wet markets where they sold all kinds of different produce and meats and things and fruits. And I really studied the cooking traditions of Southeast Asia, and then started to blend in some of those flavors into our beers. And some people loved them. Some people they didn't know what to make with them. And the brewery's still there and still going, and they're successful. But I think some of those early beers might have just been a bridge too far at that time.
Yeah, it speaks a lot to being in the right place at the right time. Looking at your early journey in brewing, being where you were. It's kind of the Malcolm Gladwell, look at it as far as like Bill Gates being where he was when he was, being able to become what he is now. It's kind we all have those similar things that happen. So, maybe if the Singapore, audience had been a little more receptive at the time, you might still be there today. And
well, you never know. I might be.
Yeah.
But I was, one of the things that I really loved about being in Singapore, it was a lot like being in America, back in the day. It was just all new frontier, and people that were excited about it were really, really excited about it, and that was awesome. Mm-hmm. And, there was a brewer there, a Canadian guy named Scott Robertson, who worked at Brewworks. And he had worked in Canada and America before going out to open this brewery in Singapore. And so he was familiar with the kind of community that we have here in America, and he was very serious about, replicating that there in Asia, where, the community for a lot of things isn't as, collegiate, and there isn't as much camaraderie. And so he came to me, and he and I, really worked hard to incorporate home brewers and other brewers and any new brewer into our community. So I think subsequently, by our doing that, and we did it, not just in our own country, but we because there's so many small countries around there, we reached out to brewers outside of Singapore, and when anybody ever came to visit, we were very welcoming, and I think we created that kind of community there. And if you go there today, I think you'll find that's true. I'm in touch with a lot of the brewers from there, and I go back every few years, and I feel very lucky to have been part of that and help establish, an inclusive community as opposed to an exclusive community. And you don't find that in a lot of industries, and I'm glad that Asia adopted that. Yeah,
and it really is a hallmark of what makes craft. There's a lot of talk and banner that goes about, what exactly is craft now, and the spirit of it really is inclusion and, friendliness and, trying something new. Is kind of is the spirit of it, in the beer but the people as well. So, that's never a bad thing, no matter where it is geographically. That's always a good thing. So when go ahead.
I was going to say, and if you go out to Asia, which I recommend that anybody who loves beer should, travel around. Vietnam, Thailand, wherever you go, if you go into a place and tell them you're a brewer, I think you'll get one of those awesome, warm welcomes.
Oh, that's good. That's good. So from the venture back and the coming back to Anderson Valley, Anderson Valley brews a lot of really awesome beers. It's not just Gose's, which we're going to talk about in depth here in just a second, but barrel programs and just awesome beers. Tell us a little bit about Anderson Valley Brewing in general. What somebody who people out, not in California, should know about an awesome brewery.
Well, Anderson Valley Brewing's been around more than 30 years, and when they first started, they were like all the others, were making English style ales predominantly. And when I came on board in 2000, when I was up at Pike Place, we had started a small barrel program, and so I started one when I got here. But a lot of people had no idea, what they were. In fact, we still don't know what we're doing. But a lot of people didn't understand barrels, and there weren't very many people doing it, and so our barrel program remained fairly small. I was very fortunate to be in wine country where people know more about barrels, and Vinny Celerzo of Russian River was just down the way, and he was always been very kind and generous with his information. So I learned a lot from him, and he introduced me to some of the San Diego guys doing barrel stuff like Tommy Arthur, and so I learned a lot from them. And so our barrel program, began to pick up a little bit. And then when I left and was gone for 5 years, it carried on, but it didn't grow a lot. When I came back in 2010, I went up to Portland and was visiting a friend, and he said, "Hey, Ron Gansberg is opening a new place called Cascade Barrel House. Do you want to go down and, check it out?" And I said, "Absolutely." And I'd known Ron for quite some time, and so, he was really excited to show us around and show us what he was doing. And, the concept of having a brewery that was 100% barrel-aged beers seemed crazy to me.
Yeah.
I'd been gone for 5 years, and I didn't know what was going on. And in some ways, it was a little crazy. I mean, he's always been kind of this mad genius ahead of his time, and, his beers were fabulous, and he was running around with a wine thief, pulling them out of barrels, and we were tasting things, and I thought, oh my God, when I get back, we got to get going on this. So when I came back, I told Trey White, the new owner, and Trey's, he's like, "You want to start a barrel program? Knock yourself out. Let's go." And so we started doing barrels, and a few weeks later, Trey came to me and he said, "I went to school with a guy who works for Wild Turkey. I wonder if that would be a good contact." And we reached out to Wild Turkey, and we, eventually developed an exclusive agreement with them. So one of the first successes with our barrel program was our non-sour bourbon barrel-aged beer, which is our Barney Flats, Wild Turkey bourbon barrels. And that's been a great relationship for us. We're able to get, consistent quality and quantity of barrels to continue making that beer. And then slowly we branched out into our sour barrel program. And again, very lucky that we had an extra building that we weren't using. We had a barn on the property. And so we started doing the barrel aging for the sour beer out there. We have about 1,200 sour barrels in production now, and probably about 800 or 900 of the non-sour barrels in production. So we have a lot of barrels.
Yeah.
Lots going on. And that, a lot of people don't know us for our brew house soured beers, the Goses. And that was kind of a lucky thing too. Happenstance that, one of our, and I talk about this in the book some, one of our lab guys, a guy named Andy Hooper, who now runs Seismic Brewing down in Santa Rosa, he wanted to try an experiment with souring, mash, like a sour mash, like they do with whiskey. And I said, okay, I've tried it, but never been successful, but if you want to try it, go ahead. So we made a batch of beer. We have a little smaller brew house, so we made a small batch, and it went for, a few days, and we tasted it, and it was really terrible, horrible. kind of, gym locker meets old shoes. And I said, well, dude, what do you think we did wrong? He's like, I don't know, but I'm going to find out. And I thought to myself, Andy's a really smart guy. If he's going to find out, I better go back and do some research, and I better figure it out so we can at least intelligently talk about it. So we both did a bunch of research on, what might have gone wrong in that process, and we came up with pretty much the same conclusions, that we needed to exclude oxygen, and we needed to get the pH adjusted. And while we were sitting around one day after work talking about it, having a beer, local homebrewer Mike Luparello came up and he said, he's listening over our shoulders, and he said, man, that's a good way to make a Gose. And both Andy and I looked at him and said, a what? We'd never heard of Gose, And so we went back and did a bunch of research on the style, and I went out and got the few Goses I could find, and we tried the Goses and thought, yeah, we can do this. And so now we had a style to aim for with our kind of new brewhouse souring process that we'd developed. And, we made a Gose, and, we tasted it at our daily beer tasting, and the boss was like, yeah, this can be a thing. And I thought, really? He thinks this could be a thing? Sour, salty, German beer could be a thing? And, I was like, really? And so he had the vision, and he was right. The beer took off, and, I think it probably saved our brewery.
Really? Well,
I think without it,
without
it, sales might not have, ever really gotten back, to the growth that we had after that.
Well, it's fantastic. Your Goses are fantastic. I mean,
Thank you.
I don't know, man. I was standing, it's gotten, a little cold here over the last few days. I was just standing by the fire, drinking one the other night while dinner was bubbling away on the oven or on the stove. And it was crisp and quenching, and it was light. It was just so satisfying. There's just something about the style that just kind of, I don't know, it's just so satisfying, and it works, I think, all year long, especially because you have the different variations throughout the year, the seasonal variations that you do. But as far as like a summer beer and like a beach beer, when you talk about salt and like that salt water, salt in the air, it all kind of melds into this perfect, I don't know, it's like this other plane of enjoyment where everything kind of melds together into one. It gets a little, heady, I guess, but it's, man, that style and the way y'all pull it off is just, I mean, it's fantastic. Well, let's get into like Goses specifically. First of all, the book, Brewers Publications, Gose, available now anywhere finer beer books are sold. It's a great read, and like the other style-specific books before it, it follows a bit of a pattern. First starts with history, so I guess let's start with a bit of the history of Gose, because it's a rich history and it goes way back.
Yeah, it's probably one of the oldest surviving beer styles. It was definitely one of the oldest surviving beer styles in the world. And one could make an argument that it is the oldest surviving beer style. Back in the day, there were really, and I'm talking way back in the day, 900 years ago, before they were using hops in beer, they were really kind of just, there were two beer styles. You either made something that was big and heavy and brown and used gruit in it, and they were very alcoholic, and that was kind of their preserving, that's how they kept it from going sour. And there's, pretty ample evidence about those beers. And then the other beer that was out there they were called white beers. And, it's kind of confusing because, white, but these beers were predominantly very light beers, often made with wheat, but not always. And these beers, because they had no hops and no alcohol to protect them, they soured very quickly. So they were made to be consumed very quickly, and even when they were consumed very quickly, had, a light acidity to them. And there's, in later years, there's discussion about these beers turning sour very quickly, and some people liking them that way, and some people preferring them when they're very young. So, of those two styles of beers that existed back then, I mean, there was no way to make dark malt like black malt or chocolate malt. So stout didn't exist. The art of malting was not what it is today. Pale beers didn't exist because it was difficult to make pale malt, with the exception of making air-dried malt, which is what was often used in these white beers, and that's kind of a different process. And so, because malting, there weren't all that many varieties of malt, there weren't that many varieties of different types of beer, and beer style was much more of a regional thing. And the beer being made in Goslar 800 years ago started to become more and more popular and was emulated and copied by nearby towns. And there was probably a whole family of these white beers, that tasted slightly different, in different locations. And some of them exist today. Grodzki, I think, is one of them. Mm-hmm. There are a few others. Probably Belgian wit beer is a branch of that, family. And so these beers were out there, but Gose kept being emulated and imitated in nearby towns. And so it survived longer, I think, than most. And a lot of them have faded away, and a lot of them, like Belgian wit beer, I think grew out of that white beer or Gose family.
Yeah, and in the book, and I recommend anybody who loves to nerd out on beer. This is a great, Gose is a good style to drink and read, because it's not going to affect your memory at all. It actually probably helps lock in all the stories and the details of the book into your brain. It just the history section of the book, the first chapter or so, is it's just really interesting how we went from the Gruit beers and how it was all controlled by the government, and then eventually figuring out that hops were a thing, and then moving over, but yet still using like coriander still used in Goses, and what would you say, spruce tips, I believe, as well, are ones that are commonly used. It's just, I don't know, just a fascinating story of how it all came to be. And I mean, just in such a, we talk about the 80s being a long time ago. I mean, like you said, it was, 800 years ago. That was a completely different world. And it's just amazing that we're trying something and having something now that has those roots. So when you were working on the book, or when you were writing the book, what was the process of, for the history? Because this is where I would go to, get the history of Gose. But where does somebody who's writing the book of the history of Gose go for history of Gose? Where did you?
Well, there hasn't, at that time, there has been some. I think, when I started writing the book, we'd been brewing Gose for a few years, and so people had started to write about it. The information, even people like Michael Jackson got a few things wrong when they wrote about it, because the information that's not out there is a little sketchy. Mm-hmm. And, you have to be able to either read German or trust someone who translates German. So, the process for researching it was a lot more difficult than I thought it'd be, because there wasn't a lot about it. There wasn't a lot about it, particularly in English. And so you had to go for some German sources. And there is a lot written about it in Germany, but only for a particular period. So, when you're writing about a style that's 1,000 years old or started 1,000 years ago, I think it's important to remember that the printing press didn't even exist for 40% of that time. Yeah. So the records that you're hoping to find prior to 1450, when the printing press was invented, would all be handwritten, and they'd either be in, if you were lucky, Old German or Latin or Old Latin or some combination of those two, which I found. And, deciphering that is complicated enough, but then there are terms that we don't use anymore. And, Gruit, for example, not a lot of people agree on exactly what Gruit was. and how it was used, because the descriptions of it at different time periods in different places seem to imply that it is, different things, very different things. Some people say it's a spice. Some people say that it was part of the yeast mix. So, and it was definitely for a time not something that was on its own. It was a secretive mix that they'd blend in with the malt that you had to buy from, a government official. So researching the book was complicated because there were language problems. There was, terms that were different, and then there was just not a whole lot written in between, the 400 back to 1,000, and you had to trust other people's sources because getting your hands on, the actual things that were written is very, very difficult. Most of them in libraries that you don't even have access to. So I was very lucky. I met a guy named Benedict, who I thank about the book, and who wrote a couple pieces in the book. And Benedict is this very interesting guy. He's German, so he can read German, which is great. He even can read some Old German, which is helpful. And he's very, very enthusiastic about Berliner Weiss and Gose. And I electronically ran into him before flying out to Germany just a few weeks before, and it turned out he was going to be in Berlin the day I landed. So I landed, we met, he took me around to a couple events where I met a bunch of Berlin brewers, and we discussed this white beer tradition, which Berliner Weiss is definitely one of, and he then helped me translate things later, and sent me sources of things that he'd found, and he was just very, very helpful. Benedict's a great guy, very helpful. The book would certainly be very different had I not run into him. And his contacts were very helpful. So that made it a lot easier for me, who could read German.
There you go. Well, thank you to Benedict, because, Yeah, thank you to you, sir. I don't know if he listens to American podcasts, but if he comes, Benedict, if you're listening, thank you.
He must listen to thing on Milk the Funk, which that's another great group of folks. Shout out to Milk the Funk guys. They were also very, very helpful, and their website and their wiki is very helpful and has a lot of good information. I didn't think I'd have to cover spontaneous fermentation, but anything that was brewed 400, 500, 800 years ago probably was spontaneously fermented.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't spontaneously fermented, then it was fermented by, the bacteria, the microflora and fauna that lived in the wood. So those guys were very helpful researching that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a good group. After you talk about the history in the book, and then you go on to flavor profiles of a Gose. So I'm guessing there's some people listening to the show that have never had a Gose. What should people be? What would one expect if you get a traditional Gose? You see it at the bar, and you're like, I got to try that. What should they be expecting?
Well, again, one of the problems, and I think I try and outline this in the book by giving the flavor profile for 3 different Goses from 3 different eras. Mm-hmm. And the word traditional is kind of hard to nail down when you're talking about such a long timeline. Certainly, I think there are certain generalizations we can say that probably define a Gose, and I think that is that the majority, 50% or more of the mash bill is wheat, so it's got to be a wheat beer. I think that by almost everyone's opinion, it would be slightly sour. So, slightly sour to kind of strong, sour depending on how old it was and how aged it was. And then I think the third component that most people agree on is that it was saline to some degree. And so there has to be some salt or saline component to it. And those are really kind of the 3 hallmarks. And, I guess maybe it needs to be said today that it's a white beer, it's a wit beer, so it needs to be light in color. Although some German brewers have added some dark malt, and there is some discussion about adding a darker malt in the past. But I think by and large, Goses are light-colored, salty, sour wheat beers.
Yeah, I remember first hearing about Gose and somebody saying, yeah, it's got salt in it. And I was like, that sounds, I don't know what to think about that. And when you think about, salt, like salt water, or what, I don't know, salt in a drink, you're like, that doesn't seem right. But then you try a Gose and there's nothing more right. It's like, I guess having a salt rim glass for a margarita or something along those lines, where the citrusy and the tart and the salt, it just works.
Yeah, I think it's a flavor combo that really does work. And, one of the challenges for me was to discover where that salt component, where it came in. And some people had written that, Gose, the beer, is named after the river that, runs through the town of Goslar. Mm-hmm. And that's true. Very little doubt about that. The Gose River, people suggest, well, the Gose River must be salty. It must be minerally. And when I first met Benedict, he said, well, I'd like to hear your opinion, but when I went out there, I tasted the water, and it didn't taste so salty or minerally. And so when I was there, I hiked well out of town to get to a point where the water was running and fresh, and tasted it, and it wasn't salty. It wasn't minerally. So, maybe 800 years ago the water was different, but I doubt it. Usually rivers don't change that dramatically, and the Gose River is not a particularly long one. Its headwaters are, not that far outside of Goslar, and they come out of a mountain spring, and then it runs into another river. So it's a very short river, and I don't see where that mineral or saline character would have come from on such a short run river, so close to the mountains. So, and I don't think it have changed over time. So I don't think the river was the source of the saltiness at Gose. I think that there were a lot of salt mines in that area of Germany, and I think salt was not the expensive commodity near Goslar that it would have been, 1,000 miles away or even 500 miles away. And I think that brewers in Goslar probably started adding a little bit of salt to their brew to add some fullness to it. Because that's one of the things, if you add salt, it does add body and complexity to the beer. And I think when that beer was copied by other little towns around Goslar and then further afield in Leipzig eventually, that they also started adding salt because that was part of the flavor profile.
Yeah, it's when you think about that far back, salt, I mean, if it wasn't, right there where you could mine it, I mean, that was a big, big deal, So I'm glad that they had it there. It's just, you have to keep all that in mind when you're thinking about history.
And I think something that, as you read the book or when you read any, book on brewing history, something that brewers in particular, but even consumers need to think about is how different the world was, 800, 900 years ago. Everything was made of wood, so there was very little metal. So all your brewing equipment, with the exception of the kettle, was made of wood. And in that wood was some sort of bacteria and wild yeast that would have helped ferment whatever you were making. Things like drying your malt or heating your kettle, they were all done with wood or coal or coke, and each one of those had to be, mined or harvested in some way that took extra labor. So, the shorter the boil, the less wood you burned. Mm-hmm. The drying your malt over a fire might have been necessary during the winter or, for some procedures, but if you get away with drying it without, heating it, then that is certainly a lot easier and more economical and less work. And, each step of that is true. So the salt being, relatively close by and Goslar being a trading, on a trading route, makes sense that they would have easy access to it. It's, and if you were a brewer in somewhere where salt was rare, think of the expense or the travel that you'd have to get, to get that salt.
Mm-hmm. You go on after talking about the flavor profiles, and then is coriander Would you call coriander a must-have in today's Goses, or is that how would you classify coriander? Is it most Goses have coriander, or is it?
I would say that most of them do, and it's a traditional, spice that has been in Goses for a long time. I don't think it's a must-have, and there's some evidence that other spices were used in different places. Spruce tips were on one of the notable ones. Mm-hmm. So I think if you want to make a Gose and leave the coriander out, or try another spice, I think you're okay. I think that the palate of Gose lends itself to different fruits and different spices very nicely. That, like you said, that salty sour combo makes for a good palate for other flavors. So, American brewers always want to try new things. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of experimentation. And, I think if you stay, reasonably within the parameters, you can call it a Gose. I have had a few things that people were calling Goses that were, packed with fruit and 8% alcohol. And they were interesting beers, and actually some of them quite delicious. Mm-hmm. But I'm not really sure you can call, a purple beer at 8%, not made with coriander. I'm not sure you can call that a Gose.
Yeah.
You can call it awesome. I'm not sure you can, call it a Gose just because you kettle soured it. Your brew house soured it.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a big element of the Gose and one that may make it intimidating for especially beginning home brewers, but is the souring process, which is a whole nother level of knowledge and technique that you need to understand before you're jumping into it. The chapter on brew house technique and approach is very in depth and very thorough, and I don't know that we have time today to get deep into it, but and I'm hoping that professional brewers that are thinking about brewing a Gose get this book and read it 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times. But for the home brewers, what would you recommend as far as for the 5-gallon batch or 10-gallon batch, the method of the souring, the approach to making a Gose? Just some tips or expert advice.
Well, it really depends. Some of the home brewers I know have more complicated systems than we do here at Anderson Valley. And,
yeah.
Most of them probably don't. But, it's hard to say what approach you should take, and that's one reason that I outlined, a half dozen different approaches to how to sour the beer. I think one of the approaches I like best, there's a traditional German technique called Sauergut, and I'm probably saying it wrong, but it's outlined a little bit in the book, and that's taking a smaller, pre-beer and souring it using bacteria that's on the malt, and then taking that fairly highly acidic mini brew and blending it into your normal brew, and then boiling that to kill off all the bacteria. And I believe that's how they did it at Sierra Nevada in a similar process. And it's a traditional German method that Germans use for giving, adjusting the pH in their lagers and pilsners, and they're just not adding as much because they're not driving the pH as far. But I think that's a really good easy way to do it. It's not a hard process, and you can do it because you're doing a small amount. You can do it away from your main brewery and minimize the chances of infection. And it's traditional, and once you master that, you can start using it if you want for pH adjustment in some of your other beers. And I've not done the research on this, but Germans swear by this technique for adding complexity and character to their German lagers. And I think it's one of the many pieces that separate, American craft lagers from some of the traditional German ones that are made that are just, they have that extra complexity and extra deliciousness.
Okay. Well, speaking of deliciousness, part of what makes a beer, just kind of put a new groove in your brain when you try it for the first time. It's presentation and even food pairing and things like that. So I love style specific glassware. Maybe too much. People make fun of me for all the glasses that I have. But for a Gose, what would be the preferred glass to serve?
Well, I don't recall what the name of the glassware is in German that they use, but it is a tall, cylindrical, slightly flaring towards the top glass, similar to what Kolsch is served in, except for I think the Gose one flares a little bit more at the top, and I think that's a good piece of glassware to serve that beer. I think you could also serve it in a champagne flute or a wine glass. I think there's that quote of Napoleon's troops discovering Berliner Weiss and saying it's the champagne of the North. Mm-hmm. And I never really kind of got that. I didn't get that. I didn't understand what they meant. And then when I was in Leipzig, I had a Gose at the Ohne Bedenken, which is, the classic Gose tavern in the world. And if anybody goes anywhere near Leipzig, they should take the extra time and effort to go to the Ohne Bedenken. Great place. It's been around for over 100 years. I talk about it in the book, and its struggle and how it survived. And I tasted their Gose, and I finally got what Napoleon's troops were talking about. Their Gose was very, very soft and creamy, had this awesome effervescence, and it was very champagne-like. And I think that Goses can be that kind of beer. I think, the Gose we make at Anderson Valley is maybe a little too acidic to emulate that. It's not quite as soft. And I think that the proper glassware for that is something long and cylindrical for the same reason that's what you want when serving champagne.
Okay. Long and cylindrical. You said it flares. So the Kolsch glass, those little what is it, a stang or something like that? You said
Stant or something. I don't remember exactly how you pronounce it, but it's very similar to that, and you could use that glass.
Okay.
But the traditional Gose glass, which you'll see in the book many, many times, and I believe it's on the cover. Mm-hmm. In fact, I know it's on the cover because I'm looking at it. I'm not sure, we were never able to identify the name of that, but it's heavy-footed glass. They're usually quite large, whereas the Kolsch ones are a little bit smaller.
Yeah.
The Gose glasses are probably a half liter, and they have a heavy foot and a long, they're long and cylindrical and flare out at the top. And that, I think some of the old school, I'm talking, pre-Prohibition Pilsner glasses were that shape, and you still see smaller versions of that in some Midwest or Northwest taverns.
Okay. As far as food pairing, like our cheese, let's start with cheese. What types of cheese would you pair with a Gose?
Well, again, I think Gose has a nice palate, and so it lends itself to a lot of different flavors. And as much as I love Garrett Oliver's Brewmaster's Table Book and refer back to it often, I'm not quite as hard and fast on the pairings as some people, and I think that beer is fairly forgiving, and it's hard to have a bad pairing. Certainly there are better pairings, as Garrett does an awesome job of outlining that in his book, and he really is kind of the master of it. I personally would say Gose, in particular, pairs well with a lot of different things, and so really you need to find what works for you. Sometimes, one person's awesome pairing is another person's like, mediocre. And so I encourage folks to try different, whole spectrum of cheeses or, flavors with their different beers. And when I do these pairings, I used to, work hard and pair them all out ahead of time. And then I discovered that since people's, likes and dislikes are so individual, that now I just kind of encourage people to try one beer with all the different foods and, do that with each beer and see which one works. And again, you're going to find some better ones, stout with blue cheese is one of my favorites. And I think one of the nice things about Gose, particularly with cheese, is cheeses are fatty and flavorful, and the acidity of the Gose cuts through that very nicely. And some of the flavors that you can put in Goses, like a raspberry or something, is often pairs very well with some of the other flavors that have been incorporated into the cheese. So, a cheese with raspberry would, of course, pair awesome with a, raspberry Gose.
Yeah, we haven't even touched on adding fruit and all the variations. With the respect to not taking up too much of your time today, real quick, Anderson Valley, what is your distribution footprint? How far out are y'all distributed?
We are in 37 or 39 states. I can never remember, and we keep adding and subtracting here and there. But 30-something states, and we are in 18 countries now, I think.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So we do a fair amount of export. Not a whole lot of volume of export, but, we try and get out there, and I think by being out there and exporting, it's helped our brewery cushion a little bit of the sagging American sales that I think almost everyone is experiencing. I know some folks are having a pretty rough time out there, particularly mid-sized breweries. We've been very, very lucky, and thank God we have Gose to sell. But we've been pretty lucky, and our sales have been pretty steady.
Has any of your Gose made it back to Germany?
Yes, it has. And it's funny. You would think that the Germans would be more embracing of these sorts of beers, but by and large, Germans they're not all that excited about getting outside of the Rheinheitsgebirge, and outside of Leipzig and Goslar, you don't find a lot of Goses, a few here and there, and some of the smaller craft breweries that are popping up in Germany now are beginning to do them. But, you don't find Berliner Weiss outside of Berlin very much. These sorts of sour beers are not very popular in Germany, and there are a fair number of regional German styles that are exempt from the Rheinheitsgebot, like Gose and Berliner Weiss. They're allowed to, be brewed under the rules. But Germans are just, unless it's their region that they're used to, they don't stray much. So mostly Gose is an American thing. And I tried in the book to bring in as many Goses from around the world as I could and talk about, where they were being made. So we do have, in the back in the recipe section, I think we have over 25 recipes. And most of them are from the U.S., but we got a couple from Germany, and we got one from the Philippines, and I really tried to reach out to get some folks to submit recipes from outside the country. So there are a few. Yeah,
there's a lot of recipes in here. It's one of these books, like from Brewers Publications, all the style-specific books. You could spend a year or more, in each book, just like brewing the different recipes and perfecting, and just plumbing the depths of each style. And then as Americans, as we experiment and go on, learn the rules and then throw them away. It's a book that it's a reference book as well. It's a great story with the history, and but at the same time, it's one that you can keep going back to again and again and again, and just learning. So there's so much in here. It's an amazing. Books are an amazing thing, and you've made a great book here.
Well, thank you very much.
So
I had a lot of help from a lot of people in the recipe section in particular. I mean, having been in the industry 30 years, I have a lot of friends, and hopefully not too many enemies. And I was able to reach out to a lot of folks and get some interesting and great recipes. And one of the most difficult and complicated ones is the Firestone Walker recipe, which takes literally months to do. So, I mean, I think there's all kinds of different styles of Gose in there.
Yeah. Well, I know if you're listening here in Texas, of course, the Anderson Valley Goses are fantastic. The Kimmy, the Yink, and the Holy Gose is in the purple can.
Yep. That's our very first unfruited, unadulterated in any form Gose, and it happens to be my favorite. I think
it's fantastic.
Its simplicity appeals to me.
Yes, it is fantastic. I was
Thank you.
I was taking pictures of it and sending it to people. I'm like, go get this beer. I probably annoyed some people. It's like, you already sent this to me. I was like, oh, I'll send it again. But yeah, just a fantastic. And then you have the variation with the blood orange, which is fantastic as well. The rosé is, I saw that on the shelf too. I'm going to grab some of that when I go back to the store.
Yeah, that's my second favorite and my girlfriend's favorite. We wanted to make a beer that was a combination of Gose and rosé wine, but all our attempts at that failed. And then one of our brewers, he said, hey, I got this. And I was like, really? And he built a recipe that's raspberries and rose hips, and it's just great. Peter did a great job with that. And I'd like to say, oh, that's my recipe, but really, that's Peter's recipe.
Yeah. And
I think he got the balance just perfect.
Yeah, and there's some, the recipe, Sam Calzone, the first recipe in here I was looking at is the Sequench. I don't know if it's like the exact replica of their Sequench Ale. That's a fantastic beer too. Here in Texas, Real Ale has some really good Goses. Their variations. Brash Brewing has made some really good ones. Of course, there's, everything's black in theirs because it's, Brash is a very metal brewery, but it worked. And anyway, it's just a fantastic style. And Fal, you've written a great book that any Gose lover and any brewer should pick up and read once or twice at least. And I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's been my pleasure. All
right, everybody. Fal Allen, Anderson Valley Brewing, and Gose, brewing a classic German beer for the modern beer era. It's a Brewers publication book. You can get it on their website or anywhere finer books are sold, or go to interbrews.com/Gose. We'll have a link there as well. Fal, have a great Thanksgiving, and hopefully we'll talk to you again down the road.
All right. Thank you very much. You have a good weekend, Thanksgiving, and I look forward to having a beer with you one day.
Oh, awesome. All right. Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
This is InterBrews.
Hey guys, hope you enjoyed this episode of InterBrews. If you did, hey, show us some support. Go to our Patreon page, become a Patreon supporter, and there's exclusive interviews and episodes just for you. If you do that, if you've enjoyed the show, get a little more, and help us go on for another 7 years. It's been 7 years. We want to go on for 7 more. I guess that's a long time. 14 years for a podcast. Has anybody done that? I don't think so. Anyway, show your support if you'd like. We really appreciate it a ton, and exclusive shows. So thank you in advance, and we'll see you next episode of InterBrews.
The preceding has been a presentation of Stewed Productions.